Welcome to Coming Together for Sexual Health. I'm Tammy Kramer, and I'm thrilled to talk with you about the world we are creating by coming together for sexual health. And yes, the pun is intended. My background in thinking holistically about health as a facilitator and a doula helps me talk with our guests about celebrating pleasure, combating stigma, and making sexual health care both more accessible and more inclusive of the communities we serve. We're powered by nationally recognized experts in sexual health at the University of California, San Francisco, and the California Prevention Training Center. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not of the CAPTC or their employer. Subscribe to get our latest episodes, share with your friends, and leave us a 5-star review to help more people find us. Thank you for coming together for sexual health. In Season 4, we did a mini-series on pleasure. In this compilation episode, we've put together the first 10 minutes of each of those juicy conversations. Give this a listen and then go back to the full version of the one that speaks to you. Welcome to Coming Together for Sexual Health. Dan Savage and Ina Park, glad to have you both here today. And welcome to our mini-series on pleasure. And here to talk about how pleasure fits into sexual health, I'm thrilled to introduce you both to thought leaders. So Dan Savage is a sex advice columnist, podcaster, and author whose graphic, pragmatic, and humorous advice has changed the conversation about monogamy, gay rights, religion, and politics. Savage Love, Dan's sex advice column, was first published in 1991 and is now syndicated across the US and Canada. He also hosts the Savage Lovecast, a weekly call-in advice podcast that has tens of thousands of paying subscribers for premium Magnum content. Both his podcast and column can be found on his website, savage.love. And Ina Park, MD, is a professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at UCSF. And lucky for me, she's my colleague at the California Prevention Training Center, where she's the principal investigator. Dr. Park is a medical consultant for the Division of STD Prevention at the CDC. In 2021, she published the hilarious and informative book, Strange Bedfellows: Adventures in the Science, History, and Surprising Secrets of STDs. So welcome, Dan, and welcome, Ina.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So I'm going to start us off with a question, and then I will pass the mic to Ina, who will keep the conversation going. So to start us off, how did the two of you meet?
So Dan doesn't know it, but I think I met him probably like more than 20 years ago because I started reading his column in college, which had probably been syndicated pretty recently. So I started reading it in this alternative newspaper called the Bay Guardian in San Francisco. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, Dan.
Yeah.
So I felt like I got to know Dan through his writing well before I actually met him in person. But when I was publishing my book, a mutual friend of ours named Peggy Ornstein said, "You have to meet Dan. You will absolutely love him." And so she got me to introduce to Dan's producer because Dan has, people. You have to like get through the people so you can get to Dan. And once I got through to him, I fell in love with him, even though he doesn't play on my team. But, I've wanted to work with him for a very long time. And then I decided to ask him also to write together, which was really, really sweet. And we just did an opinion piece on gay men and MPOX recently. So that's my story of the relationship with Dan.
Well, luckily my people are hot, so they're fun to go through to get to me. I was given Ina's book to read and absolutely loved it and had Ina on the show. And Ina's been so generous ever since we first had her on the show to talk about Strange Bedfellows with her expertise and sharing it with my listeners and my readers. Peggy passing the book on to me was the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Yes. So Dan, now I get to take the floor for a minute because this podcast is about sexual health and this little mini series is about pleasure. And I have to tell you, I got to make some confessions here about how I have thought about sexual health for a very long time. And being medically trained, I will tell you, I really thought of it as very much just the absence of disease. And other components of sexual health really did not come into my purview. But I am guessing that you think about sexual health really differently. And I want you to share a little bit about your probably broader definition in your mind as you've, talked to thousands of people about their sexual health.
Well, the way sexual health was always framed when I was growing up was the path to achieving optimal sexual health was to have as little or no sex as possible. That having sex brought into your life risks. And yeah, if everyone could just agree to have as little sex as possible with the smallest number of people possible, everyone would be very sexually healthy. Everyone would also potentially be sexually miserable because what's fulfilling for one person, and maybe there are people out there that waiting until marriage and then having a monogamous relationship, one man, one woman for life, they used to call that, is their path to sexual fulfillment and they will be blissfully happy. That is not, I think, the overwhelming majority of people's idea of sexual fulfillment. And I think sexual fulfillment and sexual health really work hand in hand. They reinforce each other. If you're sexually repressed, if you're miserable sexually, you're likelier when opportunities present themselves to lunge at them in a way where the risk is greater than it might be if you brought into your life the things you wanted to do, the people you wanted to sleep with in a thoughtful way. And that's the kind of sort of universal sexual health that I have long advocated. That how can you be who you are sexually, do what you want to do sexually, be with the people or person you want to be with while minimizing and mitigating those risks. I long ago identified this weird tick when it came to sex as a human activity, as a potential pleasure center, where with this one activity, no risk at all was the only acceptable degree of risk. And if there was any risk inherent in the sexual activities that you were enjoying or indulging in, that was irrational, which is a weird standard because we apply that standard to no other human activity. Dinner comes with risks of foodborne pathogens.
And choking on a big piece of meat.
Choking on a big piece of meat, that's not just a risk for dinner, that's a risk for going
It's a
to
risk for
Berlin.
sex.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
a risk for sex. But people have a chicken salad for lunch and die of salmonella poisoning. We say to people, cook that chicken, don't eat the raw chicken, and you'll be less likely to die from chicken salad for lunch. But we don't tell people not to eat chicken salad, not to go skiing. Sonny Bono, Cher's first husband, slammed into a tree skiing, dead from skiing. We don't tell people that if their pleasure can be found climbing mountains, even though some people have fallen off mountains and died, that they shouldn't do that. We tell them hopefully how to do that safely. Backcountry snowboarding is something I've done. That's inherently risky.
Right.
And we're fine with those risks. There's a risk benefit analysis, the pleasure, the risk, what you can do to minimize or mitigate the risk, but while still pursuing the pleasure. But when it came to sex, we said, oh, there's risk there. So you can't or shouldn't do that. And if you do choose to do that, that's not rational. And to me, that just seemed crazy because it
Yeah.
wound up with people being sexually repressed and then bursting out because sex is powerful. We pretend we're in charge of it when it's in charge of us. We are a product of millions of years of evolution driven by sexual intercourse. It's building whatever comes after us. And
Right.
I had seen in my own life people who attempted to pretend that they were negotiating with sex from a position of power. They were in charge of sex. No, sex is in charge of you.
Right.
There's lots I'd like to change about sex education. But one of the things we tell kids is one day you will grow up and have sex. And what we need to tell kids is one day you will grow up and sex will have you.
Well, and that we are somewhat beholden to what we enjoy and what we find pleasurable, right? Because that's what drives us and that's what we seek. And all of us on some level are pleasure seeking, right? So I think pleasure, it sounds like for both of us, did not enter the conversation until later when we started thinking about sex. And, it's funny because the World Health Organization, which I don't think of necessarily as the most sex positive organization, even mentions pleasure in their definition of sexual health, which I thought was great, and safety, and having the absence of coercion and violence as important for sexual health. I think the whole pleasure topic and the fact that pleasure and sexual health can be intertwined is something that from the medical standpoint I am really not used to, and it sounds like you have evolved, Dan, to be able to integrate those two ideas finally in your own mind.
When you think about it, pleasure is why we have sex 99.999% of the time. We have sex for fun, intimacy, connection, to create community, whether that's a community of two people in a relationship that's exclusive and long term, or a community of friends or lovers who are sexual. That's what sex is for. And we walk around pretending sex is for reproduction. When we look around and we see what sex is actually doing in the lives of our friends, our lovers, our partners, our communities, our cultures, and it's doing something so much more than just making more humans. And that's the complicated part, the pleasure part. And it's hard for people to talk about because there's still this lingering sense that sex for pleasure is somehow illegitimate. I'm 58 years old. I'm old enough to remember a time when it was a kind of culture war roaring debate about reproductive sex and sex for pleasure. And sex for pleasure was held up as illegitimate somehow. Procreative sex, recreational sex, those were the words I was searching for. Those
Yeah.
were the terms applied to it in the 70s when I was coming of age. It was procreative sex and recreational sex. And I think the emergence of large communities of openly gay men and lesbian women really did call the question for straight people, not about whether they could put up with us, tolerate knowing that they knew that we existed as opposed to knowing us without knowing we existed. But our lives really demonstrated what sex actually did, which was create couples, create throubles, create communities, create bonds, create pleasure, but not just in our lives, in straight people's lives too. It was very dislocating for me as a kid, as a gay kid, to be told constantly that there was something wrong with the sex I was having or wanted to have because it couldn't make a baby, when all I saw in my life were straight people having sex, desperately trying not to make babies,
Right.
getting abortions, getting their hands on condoms, getting onto contraceptives, having sex, and then in a white hot panic that they might have gotten pregnant or gotten someone pregnant. And it seemed to me like if procreation was the whole point and it made straight sex morally superior to gay sex, why were you straight people that I knew always in such a white hot panic about
Right. About getting pregnant accidentally. It's true.
avoiding conception? Right.
Well, and I feel like anxiety and fear are one of those barriers, you know what I mean, to actually experiencing pleasure. And I wanted to ask you actually about that because I know you've talked to thousands of people about their sex lives. And I'm curious, what do you feel like are the most common things that you hear that are getting in the way of people experiencing pleasure?
Fear of rejection.
Hmm.
People will often wait. They're dating someone and they don't tell that person who they are or what they want. Often with women who are so socialized to bury their own desires under caring for others, nurturing for others, meeting men's needs, women often don't realize until long into a relationship what their own desires are. They surface for women, I think, often later in life. And people get into this corner where the stakes are now so high. If I tell you who I really am, what I really want, I've made a huge emotional investment. Maybe we're married, maybe we have kids. And
Hmm.
so you leaving me now because of who I really am sexually, whether I'm bi and I never told you that, whether I have kinks that I've never told you about, is scary. And so people withhold that information.
Welcome to Coming Together for Sexual Health, Michelle Lopez. I am so excited to have you on today. We're going to be talking about HIV, pleasure, women, trauma, all kinds of topics that weave together. And today, Michelle is with us as an advocate for public health among Black and Latinx communities with over 30 years of experience working in HIV and AIDS prevention, healthcare navigation, substance use services, and has contributed so much to research as well. She's worked with immigrants migrating to New York, linking them with care and services for an HIV diagnosis. She's served on boards of directors and advised on policy development that impacts the lives of marginalized communities. Today, she's focusing a lot of her energy on designing research methods that meaningfully engage community members. So, welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Today, you and your audience is going to be in for a treat. They're going to be speaking to this out bisexual woman, this immigrant woman, this woman who I keep saying it, I fit the AIDS pie. But because she's here and through these lived experiences have created many years of wonderful outcomes impacting the lives of individuals who've been marginalized, diagnosed with HIV, homeless, immigrants. So we're in for a treat.
You say it's your favorite topic. What about this is your favorite topic, talking about HIV, women, pleasure?
This topic, HIV, women, sex, sexual health, my God, being self, loving, it takes me full circle really to the life that I live today. I am living a life that I've never lived before, and I'm really happy. I'm going to share some trauma experiences, what got me through that trauma, There are certain behaviors, the things that I did, I don't do it anymore. But I don't forget because of those experiences is what helped me to get to the point where I'm at, where I can help another person. I can identify behaviors when I see it.
Mm.
But most and foremost is learning. The learning that came out of that, love yourself. And some of us really don't know how to go about loving ourselves. I love telling stories, but my stories that I tell can then be utilized. You're going to have a lot of aha moments.
Well, let's start with your personal story if you're up for that.
My personal story, there are things that I'm going to be sharing now in this conversation about my life that is going to be able to put information again into context. I'm an incest survivor, and it all started on a beautiful island where I was born and raised. It's called Trinidad. Everyone knows it, Trinidad and Tobago. At the age of 7, my mom and my dad had a separation, and my godmother, she stepped in. This is what we do in the Caribbean. Different family members, step in. And she stepped in to help my dad because my dad was now in the care of 6 children, 4 girls, 2 boys. The first night that I got taken, myself and my younger brother, to live with my godmother because of this help she wanted to render to my father, I was sexually molested. And this molestation started from the age of 7 until 12, because by the time I turned 12, my mom and my dad had worked things out and she came back at home.
Mm.
And here I am because my memory of my mom and my dad were the best of moments that I had. My parents loved their children, but what they were not aware of were different effects that happened to each of us as their children because of this separation. I never threw that in my parents' face, but what they had to deal with was a very dysfunctional, acting out teenager that they just couldn't understand what my behavior was about. And this behavior started because I was drinking. Behavior was what we know and is what we're going to do. And I remember hearing adults around me saying, boy, you take a good drink, you ain't had nothing to worry about. I'm giving you, Trinidad dialect. So what did this 7-year-old, 8-year-old started doing because of this molestation? I started having drinks and I used to be drunk
Mm.
when the molestations was going on. And yeah, so by the time I'm 12 and mom and dad is back together, they now have to deal with a 12-year-old. She's back in a safe household, but a 12-year-old who now drinks. And they couldn't understand what this drinking was about. And I never shared with them because I wanted that household again. I wanted mom and dad back together. It's one of my first indicators when trauma comes into our lives. The point in time that this trauma came into our life is what set me on the pathway of self destruction, substance use. But it's because of a situation and it's because of circumstances. So I use that as an educational piece when I speak to individuals today. When I work now, I provide one on one as a peer. But it took me also to, at the age of 16, I had then attempted suicide, my third attempt, and I almost died. And my aunt was visiting Trinidad for the carnival season. Trinidad is known for our carnival festivities. And after the carnival was over, my mom said to her, you're taking Michelle to live with you in New York because if she stays here, either she's going to die or somebody's going to kill her. I came out and, used words to my parents at the age of 13 because I got caught in the locker areas in school kissing a girl. And this was, as my teacher used the word, oh, this is new. They hang out in the lockers and they smoke and they drink and they do, but this is new. She's in here making out with girls. And I remember my mom taking me home. It's like, Michelle, what is wrong with you? What is going on? And I had an older sister who was also acting out. But guess what? She was dealing molestation too, and nobody knew. There was a book in my life that I then read. I love reading, called She's Come Undone. And the author is Wally Lamb. And I had such an identity. I started paying attention. The things that happened to me and how my behavior was aligning. So when I started using, because I graduated from alcohol then and I was smoking pot, we said weed in Trinidad. I was smoking weed at the age of 12. And my mom then saw these behavior, but again, we don't know of taking your child to a therapist. No, I remember being taken to a clinician. I remember the clinician saying, this child is drunk. She have a drinking problem. But that same clinician also too treated me for an STI. I remember him. He said it to my mom, Miss Lady, that's how they speak. Miss Lady, somebody do something to this little girl. She have an STI and that came from sex.
Mm.
I remember those conversations. So how my mom dealt with it, I guess, was she looked at it again, voodoo. One of the interpretations my mom did back then as a Caribbean woman. And I remember every Friday being taken to this voodoo priest. He was boiling herbs, and he had castor oil and different oils that he would put, and he would let me drink it, and he would then stick his hand down my throat and say, "Oh, move away, everybody! The demons are coming out," because then I'm throwing up furiously. So these are things that were in my pathway. And by the time I'm 16 and here I am, my mom sent me, I felt abandoned. My mom and my dad agreed with her. This would be a safer setting, not realizing I was sent into the belly of the beast. Events happened in my life from being raped, from just having different individuals sexually abuse me, and I endured it because that's what I knew. And I figured this was a way for me to survive. So here I am at the age of 24. I'm living a life of survival. I have two other friends, two other young ladies that I reconnected with that went to high school with me in Trinidad, and we are roommates living in Brooklyn, New York.
Mm-hmm.
I had a son. My son's father was someone that I met just again from my life living out there. I'm raising my son, and all is well. And there was this parade day going on in Harlem, and I would just pick up myself and just go places and meet people. And I went to Harlem, and I'm having this conversation. I met this guy that then became my daughter's father. And
Mm-hmm.
this is where my life experience, it feels like I earned a degree from UCLA, the University of the corner of Lenox Avenue, because that's where I met my daughter's father. And my life changed. I met someone who promised me the world. I met someone who just was so loving to me, and he wooed me. I was living a life where there were times I was in a relationship with a female, and then there were times I'm in a relationship with a man. I was just living. And when I met this man, he sold dreams to me that they sound very realistic, that it was going to happen. And I became pregnant. And during my pregnancy, I started noticing behaviors with this man that it was just not conducive, from abuse to physical abuse, mental abuse.
Mm.
He just changed. And I don't know what brought that change about, but I knew I had to get out of that household. And I left and I made contact with my sister. And I told her, I am pregnant. I just need help. She asked me, was my son, I had sent my son to live in Trinidad with my mom. I started living with my sister, and because I was sniffing cocaine while pregnant with my daughter, and my sister said, "You cannot stay here." And she threw me out. So I went into a woman's shelter, and I did let them know the type of life that was going on. And when I went into labor and I had my daughter, she was a healthy baby. I was not in communication with her dad anymore, and she was born. And by the time she was 9 months old, I was now living in a household with another person who was severely battering me. And I got beaten very severely one night. It was the worst beating, but it was one of the best beating because I left the household and I started riding the trains with this newborn baby at 9 months old. And this is 1990. and I saw an ad while I'm riding the trains, and the ad spoke to me. If you're a woman and you're enduring substance use and you're homeless, you're dealing with bad, I mean, it spoke to Michelle. I wrote the number down. And when I started the journey on that train ride, I started out in Queens. I ended up in Brooklyn. And that's when I saw this ad and I wrote the number down. It was morning time and I got to a stop. And when I got off the stop and I walked upstairs, I dialed the number that I wrote down from that ad. A real person answered the phone. I just started speaking and I broke down and I started crying. She was a nurse. And I told her what was going on in my life, just of me being beaten, of me using substances, me just having this newborn baby. And she said, "Where are you standing right now?" And I disclosed to her, I said, "I'm standing on Flatbush Avenue and Nevin Street." I said, "I'm in the Brooklyn area." And the woman gasped. I said, "Oh my goodness." I said, "Miss, did I say something that, you cannot help me?" She said, "I want you to turn around and I want you to face west of Nevin Street." She said, "And if you walk 5 blocks in, you're going to find me." And I did. When I walked down to that facility, it was a nurse. Her name was Lily Chan, and a group of other folks was there waiting for me. And that day, I sat in a room and I was asked, "Would you be willing to take an HIV test? Because of the things that you shared with us, you and this baby might have been exposed to HIV." And I said, "But women don't get HIV." I was educated right there on the spot. I got a quick one-on-one and I agreed. And I was placed in a shelter for women, families that night. And back then in 1990, you had to wait 2 weeks to get your results. We didn't have the rapid test. And 2 weeks of me being in that shelter, the counselor called me and she said, "I'm going to come pick you up. We need to discuss with you." And the baby's results came back in. She did not disclose to me over the phone. She took me back to the facility and I was sat and told, "Michelle, you're HIV positive. And so is your baby."
Welcome to Coming Together for Sexual Health, Rodney McCoy. So glad to have you on today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Rodney, or Rod McCoy Jr., brings his expertise of nearly 4 decades in HIV prevention and education, as well as his real life experience as an African American gay queer man living with HIV. An Oberlin College graduate with his bachelor's in sociology and Black studies, Rod has worked in a variety of capacities in the field of HIV prevention, from health educator and HIV counselor to program director. As an adjunct professor at George Mason University, Rod established the HIV Culture and Sexuality course for the school's Global and Community Health Department. Rod created a sex positivity training for public health professionals called Beyond the Red Ribbon, in collaboration with Louis Shackelford of the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. He currently works at Us Helping Us in Washington, D.C. as a research assistant. What a bio!
Thank you. I'm 56 years old. I've done quite a bit, and that doesn't list everything. So I think some maybe of the salient points that might be helpful for today's discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we will be talking today primarily around BDSM and kink in communities of color and how this relates to the provision of care around sexual health, how we can support people in experiencing the pleasure that they're seeking and wanting.
As I was hearing you read the bio, something that always comes to me is HIV as a profession. I didn't choose it, it chose me. When I think about all of the things that I've done over close to 40 years, there's just for me, HIV prevention and care is such a dynamic field. There are just so many things that have, even in recent years, have emerged from conversations around PrEP and now DoxyPEP, conversations around HIV and aging and what it means to be older. Thank God we're now starting to talk about sex and pleasure, sex positivity and pleasure-based strategies. And it's just amazing to me how years ago, these things were not even thought of. These things were not on the radar. But to see these things emerge has just been mind blowing. I mean, there have just been things that have been game changers in terms of how we talk about HIV, how we approach service provision, when we look at trends, when we look at who is impacted, what are the issues that people face. That's what I love about HIV as a profession, that is. And being able to bring myself as a person with whom HIV is living with them to say, this isn't just a concept. We are talking about people. This is also poignant for me because when I started in HIV prevention, I was 18 years old. I was a kid in so many ways. And now to be 56 and still going strong and doing something I never thought I would do, and that is be part of research. I'm just honored, blown away, all of that good stuff when it comes to talking about HIV and my work in it. And I'm sure there's more to come.
And what do you do in HIV research?
So right now, let me give a shout out to us helping us celebrating 35 years of providing HIV prevention and care services in the Washington, D.C. metro area. In working in prevention, a lot of our studies has really focused on PrEP, specifically access or lack thereof to Black communities and also other what we call PrEP populations. In other words, communities most vulnerable to HIV prevention who would benefit from access to PrEP. So that's where a lot of our studies go. And we're branching off to looking at other studies where we're looking at the needs of returning citizens, people returning home from experiences of incarceration. We have another study, it's one of the first studies that we're doing geared specifically to particularly gay and bisexual men living with HIV. And we haven't done that in a while. So I'm excited to be a part of that. We have a study, HOP, which is health outcomes for PrEP populations, that looks at not only Black and Latino gay and bisexual men, but looks and speaks with Black cisgender women, that looks at transgender women and men, and that also looks to speak with and engage with injecting drug users for the purposes of saying, how can PrEP benefit you? And just really getting the feedback from the communities themselves. One of the projects that I've kind of taken a lead on is our PrEP and racism study, which is looking at how racism and other forms of discrimination keep Black, gay, and bisexual men from accessing and using PrEP. It's dynamic work. It's work that has never been done before. People asking the questions that 40 years into this epidemic that we're now finally starting to ask and do research around, particularly in the community, engaging the community, not just from the academy. So I'm very excited to be a part of it.
I'd love to hear a bit about your story and what brings you to this point.
So starting with the BDSM and being a leather man, I'd identify more as a leather man of color. Even though I am kinky, I'm more into the culture and more into the sense of community that I think leather, at least traditionally, has tried to foster. I think I've always been kinky. I love telling the story of there was a colleague when, and by the way, I didn't mention that I'm a native New Yorker and lived in New York many years before relocating to DC. So I was at a professional conference when I was cruising one of my colleagues, and he was cruising me, and we knew where it was going to go in my apartment, right in my bed. So we're doing what two grown men like to do. And at one point he said, hit me. And I was kind of like, huh? So I hit him, slapped him, kind of medium wise across the face. His eyes got big, but his body reacted in such a way that it told me, okay, he actually liked what I did. And let's just say the sex became feral. It became wild. It became primal. I mean, just all this energy, all this intense heat. And after that session was done, and we're in my kitchen sipping herbal tea because that's what you do after an intense encounter, I did some processing, asking some questions. I know it was one of my earlier forays into BDSM and kink, and I had a feeling he didn't expect it to go there. When he said hit me, what he meant was do him harder. He did not mean for me to hit him. So I have that moment of panic. But I asked him, I said, did you like it though? Were you okay? And he was like, oh yeah. So first of all, it reaffirmed the fact that I am kinky. It also reaffirmed that I probably needed community to help me navigate and explore how do I initiate the kind of play that I like more safely.
So, can you describe what is kink and what is leather?
Okay, so kink is any activity outside of sexual intercourse that gives people pleasure, maybe to the point of orgasm, but not necessarily. Kinks can be anything from fetishes, which are usually objects that cause heightened states of arousal. They can be different forms of play, like impact play. That comes first for me because that tends to be the kind of play that I like. Impact play includes spanking, paddling, bastonado, which is a particular form of impact play on the feet, caning, flogging, just to name a few from the top of my head. Needle play, which is usually the piercing of the skin with needles. Water sports, which usually involves urine play. Cum play, playing with a man or woman's cum. Any fluid that's produced at that height of orgasm can be described as cum. We tend to focus on semen, on a man's ejaculation, but women ejaculate too. So we have to embrace that as cum. When a person has an anal orgasm, anal mucus, people consider that cum too. So just the wide variety of different forms of play. That's usually what we mean when we say kink. Leather, on the other hand, in terms of a fabric and the use of leather to signify that I am into kink. Out of that came a culture that was influenced by military, by law enforcement, particularly from soldiers coming back from World War II. And now I'm giving the American story, post-World War II, and the rise of leather culture, closely tied with biker culture because of the use of leather there. But again, leather as a signifier for people who are into kink evolved into a community, a culture of traditions, of ways of being, of how to establish relationships, of things that you do, of things that you don't do. I often say the difference between leather and kink is that leather tends to be more community oriented, about culture and tradition. Kink is about self-awareness, self-expression, and really fulfilling one's sexual desires.
How does BDSM fit into those categories?
BDSM stands for bondage and domination and submission, as well as sadomasochism. So there are elements of all of those things in BDSM when we're talking about kink play, when we're talking about the larger leather community. Both leather and kink, I think, celebrate BDSM and everything that comes with it. BDSM is just those four letters to encompass all of that. Bondage, we're talking about those things that are used to restrict or restrain movement, to help assert control in a kink scene. Most commonly, people think of rope. You can do rope, you can do chains, you can do handcuffs. Domination, in other words, not just taking the lead, but taking control, really asserting oneself over someone else in a way that is consensual. And I'm going to put domination and submission together. The two go hand in hand. A person who totally takes control and totally asserts themselves in a scene over another person, and the submissive who allows that to happen because of the trust, because of the knowledge that boundaries will not be crossed, and being very clear that this is something both parties, particularly the submissive, want. Sadomasochism, sadism, the joy, the sexual pleasure, the eroticism that comes from inflicting pain, not harm, not damage, but the inflicting of pain, so that you know that the body will react by sending more dopamine to that area that you are, say, striking. If you are a dominant and you want to assert, say, mental or emotional control, one of the more intense scenes are humiliation scenes. And the idea of inflicting humiliation on someone causes arousal, causes joy, causes pleasure, causes oof. Masochism, the reception, the receiving of that pain, the receiving of that humiliation touches something in you that kind of goes, woof, woof. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Yes, dad. So that's what leather and kink really do celebrate, that whole spectrum of BDSM.
Thanks for listening, and please follow and rate us wherever you get your podcasts to help more people find us. And hey, how about sharing this with a friend or a colleague you'd like to talk with about sexual health? Check out the show notes for the resources mentioned in this episode and the transcript of the show. Connect with us on Instagram at Coming Together Pod, on X at California PTC, and at comingtogetherpod.com. This podcast is produced by me, Tammy Kramer, with our editor and co-producer, Isaiah Ashburn. We're based at the University of California, San Francisco, and would like to acknowledge the Ramaytush Ohlone people, the traditional custodians of the land that UCSF sits upon. Thank you for coming together for sexual health.